The little girl's body hit the frozen ground hard, her bare feet bleeding into the snow as she clutched a stranger's boot with fingers blue from cold. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper against the howling wind. "Please don't ride away like the others. My mama's dying and nobody will help us." Silas Brennan had spent 4 years running from the ghost of his own dead child. Now staring down at this frozen girl with desperate eyes, he understood that some moments don't ask permission. They simply demand you choose who you're going to be. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe and follow this journey to the very end. Comment your city below so I can see how far this tale of courage and second chances travels. The December wind cut through Silas Brennan like a knife through butter, but he barely noticed. 4 years of drifting had taught him to ignore discomfort, the same way he'd learned to ignore everything else, by keeping his eyes fixed on the horizon and his heart locked up tight. Copper's hooves crunched through the fresh snow each step, carrying them further from the last town and closer to the next one. Didn't matter which town. They were all the same to Silas now. Places to work, eat, sleep, and leave before anyone started asking questions or expecting him to stay. His saddlebags held everything he owned. $37 in mixed coins, a spare shirt, ammunition, and a deputy's badge he couldn't bring himself to throw away. The badge was useless now, just like the man who'd once worn it with pride. That man had died in a farmhouse in Kansas, holding his wife's hand while she bled out on the birthing bed. Their son had followed her 6 hours later, too small and too early to survive in a world that showed no mercy to the innocent. Silas shook his head sharply, forcing the memories back into their cage. "Keep moving," he muttered to Copper. "That's all we do now. Just keep moving." The horse snorted in response, ears flicking toward something ahead. Silas squinted through the swirling snow. The trail curved around a cluster of pine trees, and beyond that, nothing but white emptiness stretching toward mountains he couldn't see through the storm. Then he heard it. A sound that cut through the wind like a blade, high-pitched, desperate, the unmistakable cry of a child in distress. Every instinct Silas had cultivated over 4 years screamed at him to keep riding. Children meant families. Families meant complications. Complications meant exactly the kind of entanglement he'd sworn to avoid. He touched his heels to Copper's flanks. The crying intensified, ragged, breathless, the sound of someone who'd been screaming for help until their voice gave out. "Not my business," Silas said through clenched teeth, but his hands wouldn't cooperate. Instead of urging Copper forward, he found himself pulling the reins, bringing the horse to a stop. The crying came from somewhere off the trail beyond a snow-covered ridge. "Damn it!" Silas swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into snow that reached past his ankles. He looped Copper's reins over a low branch and moved toward the sound hand, resting on the revolver at his hip. "Hello?" His voice came out rough, rusty from days of silence. The crying stopped abruptly. Silas pushed through the snow around the ridge, and that's when he saw her. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, crouched in the snow with her arms wrapped around herself. Her dress was thin, patched in 3 places, completely inadequate for the brutal cold. But what made Silas's blood freeze had nothing to do with the temperature. Her feet were bare. Bare feet in December. In Montana. In the middle of a snowstorm. The skin had turned an ugly shade of blue-white, and dark spots of blood marked where she'd been walking. Running more likely, given the trail of red-stained footprints leading back toward wherever she'd come from. When she looked up at him, her eyes brown and huge, and filled with desperate hope, struck him like a physical blow. For one terrible moment, he saw another child, one who existed only in his imagination, one he'd never gotten to meet. "Please," the girl whispered. "Please, you have to help." Silas's throat felt tight. "Help with what? Where's your family?" She scrambled to her feet, stumbling toward him on those ruined feet. Small hands grabbed at his coat, his vest clinging with surprising strength. "My mama," she choked out. "She's sick. Real sick. She won't wake up right, and she's burning up and nobody will help us. The Thorntons slammed their door. Mr. Morrison at the general store said we ain't his problem. I walked all the way to the Hendricks place, and Mrs. Hendricks told me to go away before I brought sickness to her family. The words tumbled over each other, dissolving into fresh tears. I've been walking since morning trying to find someone. Anyone. And my feet hurt so bad, but I can't stop because Mama's gonna die if I stop and I can't. Her legs buckled. Silas caught her before she hit the ground and the lightness of her body shocked him. She weighed nothing at all, just sharp angles and desperate energy wrapped in inadequate cloth. Easy, he said, his voice gentler than he'd used in years. Easy now, I got you. You won't leave. The question held desperate hope and learned skepticism in equal measure. You won't ride away like everybody else. Silas looked down at this child with her frozen feet and tear-streaked face, and something cracked inside his chest. Something he'd spent 4 years building brick by careful brick. What's your name? Grace. Grace Weston. All right, Grace. Where's your mama? Relief flooded her face so profound it was almost painful to witness. Our cabin. It's about 3 miles that way. She pointed west with a trembling hand. Can you take me? Please, I don't think I can walk no more. Silas didn't hesitate. He scooped her up, carrying her back toward Copper like she was made of glass. The horse watched them approach with calm eyes, unfazed by the stranger in his rider's arms. We're gonna get you warm first, Silas said, reaching into his saddlebag for the spare blanket he kept rolled behind his bedroll. He wrapped it around Grace, tucking the edges tight. Then we'll go find your mama. She's real sick, mister. Been 3 days now. Started with just being tired, then the shakes came, and yesterday she stopped knowing who I was. Grace's voice cracked. She kept calling me by a different name, calling for my papa, but Papa's dead. He's been dead since March. Silas lifted her onto the saddle, then swung up behind her. Her small body pressed against his chest, shivering despite the blanket. What's your name, mister? Silas. Silas Brennan. Are you a good man, Mr. Brennan? The question hit harder than she could have known. Was he a good man? He'd been once, or at least he'd tried to be. Deputy Sheriff of Cedar County, Kansas. Husband. Almost a father. A man who believed in justice and honor and protecting the innocent. Now he was just a drifter who'd almost ridden past a freezing child because stopping felt too dangerous. I'm trying to be, he said finally. That good enough for now. Grace considered this with 8-year-old solemnity. I reckon it'll have to be. Silas urged Copper forward, and the horse moved into the wind, heading west toward a cabin that held a dying woman and whatever complications Silas had just agreed to face. They rode in silence for a while, Grace huddled against him for warmth, her breathing gradually steadying as the blanket did its work. But her feet worried him. He'd seen frostbite before, and those toes needed attention soon. How long's your mama been alone with you? Silas asked. Since Papa died, last March. He was breaking a horse for Mr. Thornton, and it threw him into the fence post. Grace's voice went flat in the way children spoke of unbearable things when they'd had to accept them. Broke his neck. Dr. Holloway said he didn't suffer none, but I don't know if that's true or just something adults say. Silas's jaw tightened. A widow and child alone for nearly a year. The fact that they'd survived spoke to either tremendous strength or sheer stubborn luck. What about the Thorntons? They couldn't help out seeing as your papa died working for them. Mr. Thornton paid for the funeral. Said that made us square. Mrs. Thornton brought food for a few weeks, but then she stopped coming. Said they had their own troubles, and we needed to learn to manage. The casual cruelty of it settled over Silas like a familiar coat. He'd seen it before. Hell, he'd practiced it himself these past 4 years. People were quick enough with sympathy when it cost them nothing. But when real help was needed, most folks found reasons to look the other way. The general store owner. Morrison, you said he couldn't spare anything. Grace shook her head. Mama owes him money, $23 from last winter when we couldn't pay for supplies. He said he ain't running a charity, and if we can't pay what we owe, he ain't giving us nothing else. And the doctor, Dr. Holloway? He came out once back in September when Mama twisted her ankle, charged $15 we didn't have, said he'd add it to our account. Grace's small hands twisted in the blanket. We owe him $40 now from when Papa was hurt and then Mama's ankle. He won't come no more unless we pay something first. Silas did the math in his head. A widow owing money to half the town trying to run a homestead alone with an 8-year-old. No wonder she'd gotten sick. The woman was probably working herself to death trying to keep them alive. Tell me about your mama. What's she like when she's not sick? For the first time, Grace's voice brightened. She's the strongest person I know. Papa used to say she could out-stubborn a mule and outwork 2 men. She knows all about medicines and herbs. Her papa was the apothecary back east before she married Papa. She taught me to read when I was 5, and she makes the best apple pie you ever tasted. Sounds like quite a woman. She is. Grace's voice dropped. That's why I know something's real wrong. Mama never stays in bed. Not ever. Even when she was sad after Papa died, she got up every morning and did what needed doing. Said lying around, feeling sorry for yourself, don't feed chickens or fix fences. How long did you say she's been fevered? 3 days. First, she said she was just tired from hauling water. Then she got the shakes real bad. Yesterday morning she couldn't get out of bed, and by nightfall she was talking to people who wasn't there. Grace's voice trembled. This morning she wouldn't wake up proper. Her eyes opened, but she didn't see me. Kept saying my name wrong, calling me Ruth. That's my aunt's name, Mama's sister who died years ago. Delirium, high fever, 3 days in. Silas had seen enough death on cattle drives to know the signs. If this woman had been alone with just a frightened child to care for, her odds were good. She hadn't had proper water, proper cooling, proper anything. We're almost there, right? Yes, sir, just over that rise. Our cabin's in the hollow on the other side. They crested the rise, and Silas's heart sank. The cabin huddled in the shallow valley like something trying to disappear into the earth. Weathered logs, gaps visible between them even through the falling snow. Roof sagging on one side, patched with what looked like canvas. A lean-to that might have once housed livestock stood empty, its door hanging crooked. No smoke rose from the chimney. No smoke meant no fire. No fire in this cold meant Silas didn't finish the thought. He urged Copper faster, and the horse responded, picking up speed despite the treacherous footing. That's home, Grace said quietly, and something in her voice suggested she knew exactly how it looked. Knew the judgment that formed in most people's eyes when they saw it. They reached the cabin door, and Silas dismounted quickly, lifting Grace down and setting her on the narrow porch that at least kept her feet off the snow. Stay here for just a moment. Let me check on your mama first. No. Grace grabbed his arm with surprising strength. I'm coming with you. I ain't leaving her again. Silas didn't argue. He pushed open the door, and the smell hit him immediately. Sweat sickness, the close air of a room that hadn't been opened in days. The cabin's interior was dim cold, far too cold for anyone sick. But what stopped him in his tracks was the woman on the bed. She lay motionless under a thin quilt, her face flushed with fever even in the poor light. Dark red hair spread across a pillow that had clearly been wet and dried multiple times. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 34 or 35, and even ravaged by illness. Something about her face spoke of the strength Grace had described. Grace ran to her mother's side immediately. Mama, I'm back. I brought help. The woman stirred slightly. Her eyes opened, hazel clouded with fever, and fixed on her daughter with obvious difficulty. Grace. The voice was barely a whisper. Grace, baby, I told you to stay. I couldn't stay, Mama. You were so sick. I had to find help. There isn't nobody gonna... The woman's eyes drifted toward Silas, struggling to focus. Who? Silas moved closer, his boots loud on the plank floor. My name's Silas Brennan, ma'am. Your daughter found me on the trail. Wouldn't take no for an answer. A ghost of a smile touched cracked lips. That's my girl, stubborn as her papa. Mrs. Weston, I need to check your fever. May I? The woman's eyes cleared slightly, and Silas saw something he recognized, the fierce pride of someone who'd been fighting alone and hated needing help. I can't pay you. We ain't got nothing. No money, no. Nobody's asking for payment right now. Silas kept his voice steady, calm, the way he used to talk to frightened witnesses back when he wore a badge. I'm just going to help you get through this, that's all. Just help. He knelt beside the bed and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. The heat radiating from her skin made him pull back instinctively, dangerously high, the kind of fever that could cook a person's brain if it lasted too long. Grace, he said, not looking away from the sick woman. I need you to do exactly what I tell you. Can you do that? Yes, sir. First, I need water, all the water you can get. Is there a well, a creek? The creek's frozen over, but there's a hole Papa cut last winter that Mama keeps open. It's about 50 yards behind the cabin. Good. Show me where the buckets are. Then I need you to get that fire going. Can you manage a fire? I've been doing it since I was 6. Papa taught me. All right. Fire first, then water. Move fast. But be careful, don't slip on the ice. Grace darted to the cold fireplace, and Silas heard the scratch of matches, the crackle of kindling catching. The girl knew what she was doing. He turned back to the woman Clara he remembered Grace calling her mama, and found her watching him with fevered but alert eyes. Why are you doing this? Clara Weston asked. Don't know us. Don't owe us nothing. Silas wrung out the rag from the water pitcher beside the bed, stale and warm, but better than nothing, and pressed it to her forehead. Your daughter walked 3 miles in the snow with bare feet to find help. Went to every neighbor, every person she could think of, and they all turned her away. But she didn't stop, didn't give up, found me on the trail and refused to let me ride past. He met Clara's eyes steadily. A child like that doesn't come from nowhere, ma'am. Means her mama raised her right. Seems to me that's worth something. Tears slipped down Clara's flushed cheeks, though she didn't seem to notice. Grace's feet, are they frostbitten? Not too bad, I checked in the saddle. She'll hurt for a while, might lose a toenail or two, but she'll keep all her toes. I'll tend to them proper once we get you stable. Clara's hand moved weakly, reaching for his. Her fingers were hot and dry, burning with fever. Promise me something. Ma'am, if this fever takes me, promise you'll get Grace to Dr. Holloway. He's a hard man about money, but he won't turn away a child with nowhere to go. He'll find her a place, a family. Promise me. Silas looked at this woman who was facing death and still thinking only of her daughter. He thought about the wife he'd lost, who'd spent her last breath telling him to be happy. He thought about the 4 years he'd spent running from that moment, from the unbearable weight of a promise he couldn't keep. I ain't gonna make you that promise, he said quietly, because I ain't planning on letting you die. So you just focus on breathing, on fighting, on staying alive long enough for your daughter to see you get better. That's your job right now. Only job that matters. Clara's fingers tightened on his. You're either the bravest man I ever met, or the biggest fool. Probably both, ma'am. Probably both. The fire was crackling now, Grace feeding it larger pieces of wood with focused determination. Warmth began to creep into the cabin, pushing back the dangerous cold. Fire's going good, Mr. Brennan, Grace called. I'll get the water now. Put your boots on first, Silas ordered. And a coat. I don't care how fast you want to move, you don't go out there without proper covering. Understand? Yes, sir. While Grace bundled up, Silas worked on Clara. He pulled back the thin quilt, frowning at how inadequate it was for keeping a fevered person either warm or cool as needed. The woman's dress was soaked through with sweat. "Mrs. Weston, I need to get you into dry clothes. Is there something—" "Top shelf, left side, blue nightgown." Silas found it worn but clean, one of the few items in the cabin that looked carefully tended. He hesitated, suddenly aware of the propriety issues involved in a stranger changing a sick woman's clothes. Clara seemed to read his thoughts. "I ain't got energy to be modest, and you ain't got time to be gentlemanly. Just do what needs doing." He worked as quickly and impersonally as he could, keeping his eyes averted as much as possible, while still accomplishing the task. By the time Grace returned with the first bucket of water, her mother was in dry clothes, and Silas was dunking fresh rags to replace the warm ones. "Good girl," he said, as Grace set down the heavy bucket. "I need at least 2 more. Can you manage that?" "I can manage." She was gone again before he could respond. Silas found himself marveling at this child, 8 years old, feet still aching from frostbite. And she moved with the focused purpose of someone twice her age. "She's something, ain't she?" Clara murmured, her eyes tracking toward the door her daughter had just exited. "Since Samuel died, she's grown up so fast. Too fast. Had to, I reckon. Wasn't nobody else to do what needed doing." "Tell me about your husband." Silas didn't know why he asked. He didn't need to know about Samuel Weston. Didn't need to know anything about these people beyond what was necessary to keep them alive. But something in Clara's voice when she said her husband's name, the mix of love and grief and pride, made him want to hear more. "Samuel was the kindest man I ever knew, patient, steady. When I met him, I was a shopkeeper's daughter from Boston, who didn't know a thing about hard work or sacrifice. He taught me everything." Clara's eyes closed, her voice dreamy with fever and memory. "We built this cabin together. Every log, every nail. Took us 6 months, but we did it. Said we were building our future with our own hands." "He sounds like a good man. The best." Tears slipped down her cheeks again. "When Grace was born, he cried. Big, strong Samuel Weston crying like a baby because he had a daughter. Said she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. And when he died—" Clara was quiet for a long moment. "When he died, part of me died with him. But I couldn't stop, couldn't fall apart, because Grace needed me. So I got up every morning and I did what had to be done. For her. All for her." Grace returned with more water, and Silas turned his attention back to the immediate crisis. The cabin was warming now, the fire crackling steadily, and he established a rhythm of cooling Clara's fever with wet cloths, while Grace kept the water supply fresh and the fire fed. Hours passed. The storm outside intensified, wind howling against the cabin walls, snow piling against the door. But inside, they worked in determined partnership, child and stranger, bound by shared purpose. As darkness fell, and Clara's breathing seemed to ease slightly, Silas allowed himself a moment of hope. The fever was still dangerously high, but maybe not quite as scorching as before. Small mercies. "Is she going to be okay?" Grace asked, settling into the chair beside her mother's bed. Her own feet were bandaged now with strips from Silas's spare shirt, the frostbite carefully tended. "I don't know," Silas said honestly. This child had earned the truth. "But I'm going to do everything I can to make sure she is." "You'll stay. You won't leave us." Silas looked at Grace, at her hopeful, frightened face, at her bandaged feet, at her small hand clutching her mother's. He thought about all the reasons he should ride out at first light. All the ways this could end badly. All the walls he'd carefully built to keep himself safe from exactly this kind of entanglement. Then he thought about a frozen girl grabbing his boot in the snow, begging him not to ride away like everyone else. "I'll stay," he said. "Long as you need me." Grace studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you." 3 words. That's all. But coming from a child who'd spent the day being turned away by everyone she asked for help, they landed like the most sacred trust Silas had ever received. He settled into the cabin's other chair, prepared for a long night. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, a fire burned, and a woman fought for her life, while her daughter and a stranger kept vigil. Silas didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Didn't know if Clara would survive, if the storm would break, if he'd made the right choice by stopping. But for the first time in 4 years, he wasn't running. And somehow, that felt like the beginning of something he'd almost forgotten how to believe in. The first gray light of dawn crept through the cabin's single window, finding Silas exactly where he'd been for the past 8 hours, beside Clara Weston's bed, replacing cooling cloths and counting the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Grace had finally surrendered to exhaustion around midnight, curling up on a pile of blankets near the fire, with her bandaged feet tucked beneath her. She slept the deep, motionless sleep of a child, pushed far beyond her limits, and Silas had made sure to keep the fire fed so she'd stay warm. Clara stirred, her eyes opening with more clarity than they'd shown since he arrived. "Grace." Her voice was still weak, but the wild edge of delirium had faded. "She's sleeping, right over there by the fire." Clara's head turned slowly, her gaze finding her daughter. Something in her face eased the particular relief of a mother confirming her child was safe. "How long have you been here?" "Since yesterday afternoon. Your girl found me on the trail." "I remember." "Pieces. You promised not to let me die." "I did." Clara's cracked lips attempted a smile. Bold promise from a stranger. "I've been told I'm a fool. Might as well be a bold one." She laughed, or tried to. It turned into a cough that shook her thin frame and left her gasping. Silas helped her sit up slightly, holding a cup of water to her lips. "Small sips, that's it." When the coughing subsided, Clara lay back against the pillow, exhausted by even that small effort. Her eyes found his face and studied it with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You're not from around here?" "No, ma'am. Just passing through." "That was the plan." Was... Silas didn't answer. He wasn't sure what the plan was anymore. 24 hours ago, he'd been riding toward nothing in particular, content in his isolation. Now he was sitting in a stranger's cabin, promising a dying woman he'd save her life, and meaning it. "You need a doctor," he said, changing the subject. "Real medicine. I've done what I can with water and cooling, but that fever needs proper treatment." "Dr. Holloway won't come without payment." Clara's voice was matter-of-fact, resigned. "We owe him $40 already." "How far is town?" 10 miles, Cedar Falls, but with the storm." "Storm's breaking." Silas had been watching through the window, tracking the way the wind had died down over the past hour. "Snow's stopping. I can make it there and back before nightfall if I leave now." Clara's hand caught his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "You'd do that? Ride 20 miles through snow for a woman you don't know?" "Your daughter walked 3 miles barefoot. Figure I can manage 20 on horseback." "The doctor won't come. Not for us. Not without money." "Then I'll convince him." "How?" Silas stood, checking his revolver more from habit than any expectation of needing it. "I spent 6 years as a deputy sheriff in Kansas. Learned a thing or two about convincing reluctant folks to do the right thing." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "You were a lawman." "Was, long time ago." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "Your girl's gonna wake up scared when she finds me gone. You need to tell her I'm coming back. Can you do that?" "I can try." "Don't try. Do it. That child's been let down by every adult in her life except you. She needs to know at least one person keeps their promises." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. "Why do you care so much about us? About whether Grace believes in promises?" The question hit closer to home than she could have known. Silas thought about his own failures, his own broken promises, the wife and son buried in Kansas soil, because he'd been too proud to ask for help when it mattered. "Because someone should," he said finally. "And right now, I'm the only one here." He stepped outside into the cold morning air. The storm had indeed broken, leaving behind a world blanketed in white silence. Copper stood in the lean-to, breath steaming, and nickered a greeting when Silas approached. "Got a hard ride ahead, boy. You up for it?" The horse tossed his head as if offended by the question. Silas saddled up quickly, his fingers clumsy with cold despite the gloves. Before mounting, he took one last look at the cabin, at the thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney, at the single window where a lamp now flickered. Clara was awake. Good. She could watch over Grace until he got back. He swung into the saddle and urged Copper forward, heading northeast toward Cedar Falls. The snow was deep, but not impossible, and the horse picked his way with the careful confidence of an animal who'd seen worse. The ride gave Silas too much time to think. 4 years he'd been running. 4 years of convincing himself that keeping distance from people was strength, not cowardice. He'd told himself he was protecting others by not getting close, that he was damaged goods, that anyone who relied on him would end up disappointed or dead. But watching Grace Weston trudge through that snow on bare feet, watching her mother fight for every breath while her neighbors slammed doors in a child's face, something had cracked inside him that he couldn't seal back up. These people needed help. Not sympathy, not prayers, not well wishes from a distance. Actual help. The kind that required showing up and staying. Could he do that? After everything, he didn't know. But he was going to try. Cedar Falls materialized through the morning mist like a painting slowly coming into focus. Maybe 40 buildings clustered along a main street, with a church steeple at the far end and a handful of houses scattered beyond. Silas spotted the doctor's office immediately, a neat clapboard building with a shingle reading, Dr. Ezra Holloway, physician and surgeon. He tied Copper to the hitching post and climbed the 3 steps to the door. A sharp knock brought footsteps. Then the door swung open to reveal a man in his late 50s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a collarless shirt and the irritated expression of someone disturbed too early. "Office hours begin at 9. Come back then." The door started to close. Silas's boot stopped it. "I've got a woman dying 10 miles from here. Fever for 3 days, delirious, barely conscious. She needs help now, not in 2 hours." Dr. Holloway's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" "Silas Brennan. I was passing through, found her daughter on the trail yesterday, begging for help." The girl's 8 years old. She'd already been turned away by the Thorntons, the general store, and 3 other places I probably don't know about. Something flickered in the doctor's expression. Recognition, maybe, or guilt. "You're talking about Clara Weston." "I am. The widow woman. Husband died last spring. Her daughter told me." Dr. Holloway's jaw tightened. "That family owes me $40 already. I made 2 house calls when Samuel was injured, and another when Mrs. Weston hurt her ankle last fall. Never saw a penny. So you let a woman die over $40. I have bills to pay, same as everyone else. A wife. A practice to maintain. I can't work for free, Mr. Brennan. This isn't charity. It's business." Silas felt his temper rising but forced it down. Anger wouldn't help Clara. He needed this man's cooperation, not his defensiveness. What would it cost to come out there today, treat her, give her a fighting chance? House call is $15. Medicine depends on what she needs. If it's pneumonia, which it sounds like we're looking at another $20 for proper treatment, plus what she already owes. The doctor crossed his arms. "Call it $75 total." Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out his leather pouch. He counted out the contents, $37 in mixed coins and crumpled bills. Everything he had. "I've got 37. I'll work off the rest. Whatever you need. Chopping wood, cleaning stables, mending fences. I'm good with my hands and I don't quit until a job's done." Dr. Holloway stared at the money, then at Silas. "You'd do that work off a stranger's debt?" "Yes." "Why?" The question again. Everyone kept asking it as if kindness required justification, as if helping someone in need demanded explanation. Because her daughter asked for help and I was there. Because nobody else would listen. Because I've spent 4 years pretending other people's problems weren't mine, and I'm tired of being that man. Silas held out the money. "Take it or don't, but make a decision. That woman doesn't have time for us to stand here debating." A long silence stretched between them. Dr. Holloway's expression shifted through several emotions: calculation, reluctance, and finally, something that might have been respect. "You were a lawman once." It wasn't a question. Silas wondered how the man knew, then realized it didn't matter. "Deputy Sheriff, Kansas. Gave it up 4 years ago." "Why?" "Because I failed at everything that mattered and didn't have the stomach to keep pretending I hadn't." Dr. Holloway took the money. "Give me 10 minutes to gather supplies. There's a trough around back for your horse." The door closed, leaving Silas on the porch with empty pockets and a knot in his chest that might have been hope. He watered Copper and let the horse rest while he waited, his mind drifting back to the cabin 10 miles away. Was Clara still conscious? Had Grace woken up yet? Had his promise been enough to keep that child from panicking when she found him gone? He didn't know. Couldn't know until he got back. And the not knowing gnawed at him in ways he hadn't felt since Eleanor. Since those last terrible hours when he'd raced back to the farmhouse, knowing he was already too late, praying anyway, bargaining with God for a miracle he didn't receive. "Mr. Brennan." Silas turned. A woman stood on the boardwalk, middle-aged, well-dressed, with a face that might have been kind, if not for the pinched expression she currently wore. "I'm Edith Thornton. I understand you've been to the Weston place." "I have." "How is Clara?" "We heard the child was asking for help yesterday, but Hiram, my husband, he thought it best not to get involved. We've had illness in our own household this winter, and he was concerned about spreading sickness." "Yes. Your husband made that clear when he slammed the door on an 8-year-old girl with frozen feet." Mrs. Thornton flinched. "That's not... Hiram can be harsh, but he means well. We've given that family quite a lot already. Paid for Samuel's funeral, brought food for weeks afterward." And then stopped, when it got inconvenient, when it required actual sacrifice. "You don't understand how things work out here, Mr. Brennan. Everyone's struggling. We can't carry every burden. If people can't manage on their own, then they die." Silas's voice was flat. "Their children freeze in the snow begging strangers for help because their neighbors decided carrying every burden was too much trouble." Mrs. Thornton's face went pale. "That's unfair." "Maybe, but it's also true." Silas saw Dr. Holloway emerging from his office with a medical bag. "Excuse me, I've got somewhere to be." He mounted Copper and waited for the doctor to bring his own horse around. Mrs. Thornton still stood on the boardwalk watching with an expression Silas couldn't read. "Mr. Brennan," she called as he turned to leave. "Tell Clara. Tell her I'll come by. When she's better, I'll come by and we'll talk." Silas didn't respond. Words were cheap. He'd believe Mrs. Thornton's concern when he saw her actually show up. The ride back felt twice as long as the ride there. Dr. Holloway kept pace, but didn't attempt conversation, for which Silas was grateful. His mind was on Clara and Grace, on all the ways things could have gone wrong in the hours he'd been gone. When the cabin finally came into view, smoke still rising from the chimney, Silas released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They dismounted and tied the horses. Silas pushed open the door and found Grace standing just inside, her face tear-streaked, but determined, holding a cast-iron skillet like she intended to brain whoever walked through. "Grace, it's me." The skillet lowered. Grace's composure crumbled. She dropped the pan and threw herself at Silas, her small arms wrapping around his waist with desperate strength. "You came back. You really came back." "Told you I would." "I woke up and you were gone, and Mama was so weak she could barely talk, and I thought... I know what you thought." Silas crouched down to meet her eyes. "But I made you a promise, and I keep my promises. Understand, no matter what, I keep them." Grace nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Then her gaze moved past him to Dr. Holloway, and wariness replaced relief. "You brought him... He's going to help your Mama." "He wouldn't help before. Said we owed too much money. Dr. Holloway cleared his throat awkwardly. Grace, your mother's debt has been addressed. I'm here now. That's what matters. Grace looked between the doctor and Silas, clearly connecting dots. You paid him with what? Don't worry about that. But, Grace. Clara's voice came from the bed, weak but conscious. Let the doctor do his work. You can ask questions later. The next hour passed in tense silence as Dr. Holloway conducted his examination. Silas kept Grace occupied by the fire, helping her rebandage her feet with proper supplies the doctor had brought. He's really going to make her better? Grace asked quietly. He's going to try his best. What if his best isn't enough? Silas thought about Eleanor, about the doctor who'd done his best and still failed, about all the ways medicine couldn't always win against death. Then we'll deal with that together. But right now, your mama's got something she didn't have yesterday. She's got help, real help. And that makes a difference. Dr. Holloway finally straightened from his examination, his expression grave but not hopeless. It's pneumonia. Both lungs involved. She's seriously dehydrated, which has made everything worse. He pulled several bottles from his bag. I've got medicine that should help: willow bark extract for the fever, a tincture for her lungs, laudanum for pain and rest. Is she going to live? Grace's voice was barely a whisper. The doctor looked at her with something like compassion breaking through his professional demeanor. Your mother is very sick, child. If this had gone on another day, maybe even another 12 hours, I don't think there would have been anything I could do. He paused. But she's got a fighting chance now. The next 24 hours are critical. What does she need? Silas asked. Rest, fluids, medicine at regular intervals, someone to keep her fever down and make sure she keeps breathing steady through the night. Dr. Holloway's eyes met his. She needs someone to stay. I'm staying. For how long? Silas glanced at Grace, at her hopeful, terrified face. At Clara on the bed, watching him with eyes that asked the same question everyone kept asking. Long as it takes. Dr. Holloway nodded slowly. I'll come back tomorrow to check her progress. If the fever breaks tonight, she's got good odds. If it doesn't... He didn't finish the sentence. The medicine schedule is written here. Follow it exactly. No more, no less. He handed Silas a paper covered in neat handwriting, then gathered his things. And Grace? The doctor crouched beside her. I owe you an apology. When you came to my door yesterday, I should have listened. I was thinking about money when I should have been thinking about doing what's right. He reached into his pocket and produced a small peppermint stick. This doesn't make up for it, but I'm sorry. Grace looked at the candy, then at the doctor's face. Mama says sorry don't mean nothing if you don't change what you're sorry for. Your mama's a wise woman. So are you gonna change? Are you gonna help folks who need it, even if they can't pay? The question hung in the air, simple and devastating, the way only a child's question could be. Dr. Holloway stood slowly, his expression suggesting he was hearing himself judged and found wanting. I'm going to try, he said finally. Grace considered this, then took the candy. Trying's better than nothing, I reckon. After the doctor left, the cabin fell into quiet rhythms. Silas administered the first doses of medicine, while Grace heated broth they'd made from dried meat and root vegetables. The storm had passed, leaving behind brilliant sunshine that seemed to mock the struggle happening inside these walls. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, lucid enough sometimes to take her medicine, confused other times about where she was and who was with her. Samuel, she murmured during one of these spells, her hand reaching toward Silas. Samuel, is that you? No, ma'am. It's Silas. Silas Brennan. Her brow furrowed. Where's Samuel? Silas looked at Grace, who had frozen by the fire with pain written across her young face. He's not here right now, Mrs. Weston. But Grace is. Your daughter's right here. Grace. Clara's eyes searched the cabin. Grace, baby. I'm here, Mama. Grace hurried to the bedside, taking her mother's hand. I'm right here. I ain't going nowhere. Clara's face relaxed, the confusion fading as her daughter's presence anchored her. My good girl, my brave girl, what would I do without you? You ain't gonna have to find out. Mr. Brennan brought the doctor. You're gonna get better now. The doctor said so. Did he? Clara's gaze drifted to Silas. And what does Mr. Brennan say? I say you're too stubborn to die and too ornery to give up, so you might as well focus on getting better because you ain't got any other options. A weak laugh escaped Clara's lips. Ornery. Grace tells me you can out-stubborn a mule. Figure ornery goes along with that. She said that... Papa used to say it, Grace interjected. He said it all the time. Clara's eyes softened, and for a moment Silas saw the weight of grief she carried the way losing her husband had left wounds that might never fully heal. He did say that, didn't he? Clara whispered. Stubborn as a mule and twice as pretty, he used to say. Made me laugh every time. Tell me about him, Silas said, settling into the chair by her bed. Tell me about Samuel. Grace looked surprised by the request, but Clara didn't hesitate. As if talking about her husband was as necessary as breathing. She began to speak haltingly at first, then with growing strength. She told stories about how they'd met, about their courtship, about the dream of heading west to build something of their own. She told stories about Grace as a baby, about Samuel learning to change diapers and rock his daughter to sleep. She told stories about hard times and good times, about the life they'd built in this hollow, about the cabin Samuel had constructed with his own hands. Silas listened without interrupting, occasionally glancing at Grace, who sat transfixed, hearing her family's history through her mother's fever-weakened voice. He would have liked you, I think, Clara said eventually, her words slurring with exhaustion. Samuel. He was a good judge of character, always knew who to trust. I hope I'd have earned that trust. You're here, aren't you? You stayed when everyone else left. Clara's eyes were closing the medicine, pulling her toward sleep. That counts for something, Mr. Brennan. That counts for a lot. She slept. Grace watched her mother's chest rise and fall with the desperate attention of someone counting every breath. Mr. Brennan, can I ask you something? Go ahead. When Mama gets better, what happens then? Are you going to leave? The question Silas had been avoiding since yesterday. The question he didn't have an answer to. I don't know, Grace. Hadn't planned past today. Maybe you could stay. Just for a while. Mama's gonna need help when she's getting strong again. She won't be able to do all the work, and I'm too small for some things, and maybe... Grace's voice trailed off. Maybe we need somebody. And maybe you don't have nowhere else to be. Silas looked at this child who'd walked barefoot through a blizzard to save her mother, who'd faced rejection from everyone she'd asked and still hadn't given up, who was now asking a stranger to become something more. Let's get your mama well first, he said carefully. Then we'll talk about what comes next. But you'll think about it, about staying. He thought about the trail, about the endless miles stretching toward nowhere in particular. He thought about the silence of riding alone, about the nights spent camping under stars without anyone to share them. He thought about 4 years of running and where it had gotten him. Yeah, he said quietly. I'll think about it. Grace smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since they'd met. It transformed her whole face, made her look like what she was, a child who still had hope despite everything life had thrown at her. Good, she said. That's good. The hours crept past. Silas maintained the medicine schedule with careful precision, administered water whenever Clara surfaced enough to drink, changed the cooling cloths on her forehead. Grace helped where she could and stayed out of the way when she couldn't. As evening fell and the temperature dropped, Clara's fever remained high, but stable. Not better, but not worse either. The doctor had said 24 hours were critical. They were maybe 8 hours in. Silas settled in for another long night, knowing sleep wasn't an option. Not with Clara's life hanging in the balance. Not with Grace counting on him to keep his promise. Sometime after midnight, with the fire crackling low and Grace finally asleep in her pile of blankets, Clara's hand found his in the darkness. "You're still here," she murmured. "Told you I would be." "Most folks don't keep their word." "I know. Why do you—" Silas considered the question, turning it over in his mind. Why did he— What made him different from the Thorntons, from Dr. Holloway, before he'd been shamed into helping, from all the people who'd looked at Grace Weston's frozen feet and desperate eyes and decided not to get involved? "Because I used to be someone who didn't," he said finally. "Someone who let down the people who needed me most. And I've spent 4 years living with what that cost." He paused. "I can't change what happened. Can't bring back what I lost. But I can choose to be different now. I can choose to show up when it matters." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Her thumb traced slowly across his knuckles. "What did you lose?" "My wife. My son. He died before he was born, too early, too small. She bled out, bringing him into the world. I was supposed to be there, but I wasn't. Got held up chasing some outlaw who didn't matter, and by the time I got home—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Hadn't ever said it out loud to anyone, not in 4 years. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered. "That's a heavy weight to carry." "It is. Does it ever get lighter?" Silas looked at her face in the dim firelight, at this woman who'd lost her husband, and nearly her own life, who understood grief in ways most people couldn't. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "Haven't figured that out. But sitting here tonight, making sure you keep breathing, watching your daughter sleep, knowing her mama's gonna be here when she wakes up." He swallowed hard. "This helps. For whatever reason. This helps." Clara's grip tightened on his hand. "Then stay. As long as this helps, stay." He didn't answer. Didn't need to. The promise had already been made, sealed by something deeper than words. Outside, the Montana night stretched cold and endless. Inside, a fire burned and a woman fought for her life while a broken man kept watch, discovering that sometimes the path to healing wasn't forward or back. It was staying exactly where you were needed for as long as you were needed, and trusting that the rest would figure itself out. The hours passed. Clara slept. Grace dreamed. And Silas Brennan sat in a cabin that wasn't his, watching over a family that wasn't his, wondering if maybe, just maybe, belonging wasn't something you were born into, but something you chose. Dawn came slow and gray, the weak winter light creeping through the frost-covered window, like it was afraid to disturb the silence inside. Silas hadn't slept. His eyes burned and his back ached from sitting in the hard chair all night, but none of that mattered, because sometime around 4 in the morning, Clara's fever had broken. He'd felt it happen the moment her skin went from burning hot to damp with sweat, the moment her breathing shifted from shallow gasps to something deeper and steadier. She'd opened her eyes briefly, looked at him with full recognition, whispered, "Thank you," and fallen into what he could tell was real sleep. Not the unconscious drift of fever, but actual rest. Grace woke with the light sitting up immediately and looking toward her mother's bed, with the desperate hope of a child who'd learned not to expect good news. "Her fever broke," Silas said quietly. "About 3 hours ago." Grace was across the cabin before he finished speaking, her bandaged feet forgotten as she pressed her hand to her mother's forehead. "She's not hot anymore," Grace breathed. "She's actually not hot. She's gonna need a lot of rest. Doctor said her lungs are still weak, but the worst is over." Grace turned to look at him, and something in her expression made Silas's chest tighten. It wasn't just gratitude, though, that was there. It was something deeper, something that looked uncomfortably like trust. "You saved her," Grace said. "You really saved her." "The doctor saved her. I just made sure she kept breathing until he got here." "No." Grace shook her head firmly. The doctor gave her medicine. You gave her a reason to fight. That's different. That's more. Silas didn't know how to respond to that, so he stood and stretched his aching muscles instead. We need more firewood. Storm left a lot of branches down, should be easy gathering. You stay here with your mama. Can you handle the medicine if she wakes up? Yes, sir. 2 drops of the laudanum, 1 spoonful of the fever tincture, as much water as she'll take. Good girl. I'll be back within the hour. The cold hit him like a wall when he stepped outside, but Silas welcomed it. After the close air of the sick room, the sharp bite of winter felt clean somehow, clarifying. Copper greeted him with a soft nicker from the lean-to, and Silas took a few minutes to check the horse's water and feed before heading out to gather wood. The work was mindless but necessary, exactly what he needed to process the last 36 hours. He'd come here expecting to help a sick woman and then move on. Simple. Clean. The kind of good deed that didn't require any real investment. But nothing about the Westons was simple. Grace with her fierce determination and old soul eyes. Clara with her stubborn pride and quiet strength. The way they'd wormed past his defenses without even trying, making him feel things he'd sworn he'd never feel again. He was in trouble. Deep trouble. And he wasn't sure he wanted to find his way out. By the time he returned to the cabin with an armload of firewood, Clara was awake and sitting up in bed propped against pillows Grace had arranged, sipping broth from a tin cup. Mr. Brennan. Clara's voice was still weak, but the clarity in her eyes made up for it. Grace tells me, I have you to thank for my life. Your daughter did the hard part. I just showed up. Don't do that. Clara set down the cup with a sharpness that surprised him. Don't diminish what you did. Grace told me everything. How you rode through the storm for the doctor. How you paid him with every cent you had. How you sat up all night making sure I kept breathing. Her voice softened. That's not just showing up. That's more than anyone's done for us since Samuel died. Silas busied himself stacking the firewood, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her eyes. I did what needed doing. Anybody would have. No, they wouldn't have. They didn't. Clara's jaw tightened. Grace went to 4 different places begging for help before she found you. 4, and every single one turned her away. So don't tell me anybody would have done what you did because I know better. I've been living the truth of how people actually behave for 8 months now. The bitterness in her voice cut through Silas's deflections. He stopped stacking wood and turned to face her. You're right. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I know you didn't. I know you're just a humble man, trying not to take credit for being decent. Clara's expression softened. But Grace needs to see that good people exist, that not everyone will abandon us when things get hard. And right now you're the only proof she's got. Silas glanced at Grace, who was watching their exchange with her usual solemn attention. The weight of responsibility settled over him, heavier than any load of firewood, more demanding than any night of keeping vigil. I don't know how long I'm staying, he said carefully. I made promises for the crisis. After that, we figure it out together. Clara held his gaze. I'm not asking for forever, Mr. Brennan. I'm asking for honest. If you're gonna leave, tell us now so we can prepare. Don't let us get attached and then disappear. The directness should have felt confrontational. Instead, it felt like exactly what Silas needed, someone willing to call him out, to demand he stop hiding behind his own uncertainty. I'm staying through your recovery, he said. At minimum. After that, we'll talk about what makes sense for everyone. Clara nodded slowly. Fair enough. But just so we're clear, whatever debt you think you're working off with that doctor, I intend to pay you back. Every cent. This family doesn't take charity. It's not charity if I'm choosing to give it. It's charity if I can't reciprocate. Then reciprocate by getting better, by taking care of yourself so your daughter doesn't lose her mother on top of losing her father. Silas's voice came out rougher than intended. That's payment enough. Clara's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Silas was beginning to understand that this woman had used up her tears long ago, had learned to convert grief into determination because breaking down wasn't something she could afford. Mr. Brennan. Silas. If I'm staying, you might as well use my name. Silas. She tested the word like she was learning a new language. I want you to know something. Whatever happens after this, whatever you decide about staying or going, you've already given us something I thought was gone for good. What's that? Hope. Clara glanced at Grace, who had curled up by the fire with a book, one of the few luxuries the cabin contained. Look at her. Really look. For the first time in 8 months, she's not carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She's just being a child, because she knows someone else is helping carry the load. Silas looked, and saw exactly what Clara meant. Grace's face was relaxed in a way he hadn't seen before, her attention absorbed by whatever story she was reading. She wasn't watching her mother's breathing, wasn't listening for sounds of distress, wasn't coiled with the tension of a child preparing for the next disaster. She was just a little girl reading a book by the fire. Something cracked open in Silas's chest at the sight of it. I had a daughter, he heard himself say. Or I would have. Eleanor, my wife. She was 8 months along when the labor started early. The baby came too soon, too small. They both died within hours of each other. Clara's intake of breath was sharp, but she didn't interrupt. After that, I couldn't stay. Couldn't look at the house we'd built, the nursery she'd painted, the cradle I'd carved. I quit the deputy job and started writing. 4 years now. Never stopped anywhere longer than a few weeks. What changed? Your daughter grabbed my boot in the snow and wouldn't let go. Silas's voice caught. She looked at me like I was her last hope in the world, and something in me just broke. The wall I'd built, the distance I'd kept. She looked at me, and I couldn't ride away. Couldn't do to her what everyone else had done. Because you know what it feels like to be abandoned when you need help most. I know what it feels like to fail the people counting on you. That's what I know. Silas finally met Clara's eyes. I wasn't there when Eleanor needed me. I was off chasing some outlaw who didn't matter being the hero instead of being the husband. By the time I got back, it was too late for anything but goodbye. That wasn't abandonment. That was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Was it? Or was it choices I made that put me there? Silas shook his head. I've had 4 years to wonder. 4 years to replay every decision that led to that day. And the conclusion I keep coming to is that I chose wrong. Over and over, I chose the job, the duty, the obligation to strangers, over the obligation to my own family. And they paid the price for it. Clara was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. I spent 3 months after Samuel died asking myself the same questions. What if I'd made him rest that day, instead of letting him help the Thorntons with their fence? What if I'd insisted we hire someone else to break that horse? What if? She shifted on the bed, grimacing slightly at the movement. You know what I learned. What? That what if is a trap. It keeps you living in a past you can't change instead of a present you can affect. Clara reached out her hand, settling over his where it rested on the chair's arm. You can't bring your wife back. Can't meet the child you never got to hold. But you can be here now for the people who need you. That's not running from your failure. That's learning from it. Silas stared at her hand on his at the contrast of her pale, fever-weakened fingers against his weathered skin. You sound like you've got it all figured out. I sound like someone who's fought the same battle and come out the other side. Clara smiled weakly. I still miss Samuel every day. Still talk to him sometimes when Grace isn't listening. But I stopped asking what if, because the answer doesn't matter. What matters is getting up each morning and doing what needs to be done for the people still here. And you think I can do that after 4 years of running? I think you already have. You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet. Before Silas could respond, a knock at the cabin door made them both start. Grace looked up from her book immediately, tense, the relaxation vanishing as survival instincts kicked back in. "Stay here," Silas said, rising and moving toward the door. His hand rested on his revolver, not drawn, but ready. He opened the door to find Mrs. Thornton standing on the porch, bundled in a heavy coat and carrying a large basket. Behind her, a hired man waited with a small cart loaded with supplies. "Mr. Brennan?" Her voice was uncertain, nothing like the defensive woman he'd confronted in town. I've come to see Clara. To apologize." Silas didn't move from the doorway. "She's recovering. Might not be up for visitors. I brought food, flour, sugar, salt, pork, dried apples, and some medicine herbs from my own garden." Mrs. Thornton's eyes were bright with what might have been tears. "I know it doesn't make up for what we did, for what Hiram did. But I couldn't. I couldn't just sit at home knowing that child walked barefoot through the snow because we turned her away." "Edith," Clara's voice came from inside. "Edith, is that you?" Mrs. Thornton's face crumpled. "Clara. Oh, Clara, I'm so sorry. I should have come sooner. I should have stood up to Hiram. I should have—" "Come inside," Clara said. "It's too cold to apologize on the porch." Silas stepped aside, watching as Mrs. Thornton entered the cabin. Grace stood rigid by the fire, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Thornton," Clara said, "you remember my daughter." The older woman turned to Grace, and Silas saw her register the bandaged feet, the thin dress, the guarded eyes. Whatever defenses she'd built up seemed to collapse entirely. "Grace, sweetheart, I'm so sorry." Mrs. Thornton sank to her knees, putting herself at eye level with the child. "When you came to our door, I should have helped you. I should have ignored Hiram and done what was right. Can you ever forgive me?" Grace looked at the woman for a long moment. Then her gaze shifted to Silas, as if asking what she should do. "That's up to you," Silas said quietly. "Nobody can tell you how to feel about what happened." Grace turned back to Mrs. Thornton. "Mama says sorry don't mean nothing if you don't change what you're sorry for." "Your mama's right. So what are you gonna change?" The question hung in the air. Mrs. Thornton's hands twisted in her lap. "I'm going to stand up when standing up is hard," she said finally. "I'm going to help my neighbors even when my husband thinks we can't afford to. I'm going to remember that everyone's struggling and that struggling together is better than struggling alone. You promise?" "I promise." Grace considered this with her usual solemn gravity. Then she nodded once. "All right. I reckon everyone deserves a second chance. That's what Mr. Brennan says." Mrs. Thornton looked at Silas with something like wonder. "You've made quite an impression on this family." "They've made quite an impression on me." The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. Mrs. Thornton directed her hired man to unload the supplies while she fussed over Clara, checking her temperature and adjusting her pillows. The two women talked in the shorthand of old acquaintances, filling in gaps, rebuilding bridges that had crumbled from neglect. Grace watched it all with cautious optimism, occasionally glancing at Silas as if making sure he was still there. Each time he nodded reassurance, and each time she relaxed a fraction more. When Mrs. Thornton finally prepared to leave, she pulled Silas aside. "Hiram doesn't know I'm here. He'd be furious if he found out." "Then why did you come?" "Because my husband being wrong doesn't mean I have to be." She pulled her coat tighter. "I've spent 30 years letting him make decisions for both of us, telling myself it was easier to go along than to fight. But watching that child beg for help, watching you ride into town covered in snow demanding Dr. Holloway do his job." She shook her head. "It woke something up in me, something I'd put to sleep a long time ago." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet, but I know I can't keep living like nothing matters except keeping Hiram happy." Mrs. Thornton met his eyes. "Take care of them, Mr. Brennan. They deserve someone in their corner." "I intend to." after she left the cabin, felt different. Fuller somehow, despite being occupied by the same 3 people. The supplies Mrs. Thornton had brought lined the shelves, enough food to last weeks, maybe months if they were careful. "That was unexpected," Clara said softly. "She's trying to make things right." "I know. I'd given up hoping anyone would." Clara's eyes found his. "First you, now Edith. Maybe the world isn't as cold as I thought. Maybe not." That evening, they ate their first real meal together. Grace had prepared biscuits from the fresh flour surprisingly competent for an 8-year-old, and Silas had heated the salt pork with some of the dried apples. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling and shared around the small table that Samuel Weston had built with his own hands. Clara was too weak to sit at the table, but Grace had carried her plate to the bedside, and the 3 of them ate together in companionable silence. "Mr. Silas," Grace said eventually. "Just Silas." "Silas." She tested the name. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "When Mama's better, will you teach me to ride? Really ride, I mean. Not just sitting on a horse while someone leads it. Papa was going to teach me, but then—" She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Silas glanced at Clara, who gave a small nod. "When your mama's better and your feet are healed, I'll teach you," he said. "Copper's gentle enough for a beginner, and you've got the determination for it." Grace's face lit up. "Really? Really? But it's hard work learning to ride proper. You'll fall off. You'll get sore. You'll want to quit." "I never quit anything in my life." "I believe that." Clara laughed a real laugh, the first Silas had heard from her. The sound transformed her face, made her look younger and lighter, gave a glimpse of the woman she'd been before grief had carved its marks into her. "She's telling the truth," Clara said. "This child has never given up on anything, not once. Stubborn doesn't even begin to cover it." "Wonder where she got that from," Silas said dryly. Clara's eyebrows rose. "Are you suggesting I'm stubborn, Mr. Brennan?" "I'm suggesting that a woman who survives a Montana winter alone with a child, works herself sick, trying to hold her homestead together, and still has the energy to argue about charity, isn't exactly known for giving up easy." "Fair point." Clara's smile softened. "Samuel always said I could outstubborn a mule." "So Grace told me." The moment stretched between them, warm and fragile. Silas was acutely aware of Grace watching them, of the hope in the child's eyes, of how much was riding on decisions he hadn't yet made. "Silas," Clara said quietly, "whatever happens, whatever you decide about staying or going, I want you to know that you've already changed everything. For me, for Grace, for how we see the world and our place in it. You don't even know me. Not really. I know you sat up all night watching me breathe. I know you gave every dollar you had to save a stranger's life. I know you're the first person in 8 months who looked at my daughter and saw someone worth stopping for." Clara's voice broke slightly. "That tells me who you are. Everything else is just details." Grace had grown quiet watching this exchange with the 2 knowing eyes of a child who'd learned to read adult conversations. "Are you going to stay?" she asked directly. "Forever, I mean, not just until Mama's better." Silas looked at this girl who'd walked through snow to save her mother. At this woman who fought like hell for her family despite every obstacle. At this cabin that had housed so much loss, and still somehow felt like it might be a home. "I don't know about forever," he said honestly. "Forever's a long time to promise." Grace's face fell slightly, but she nodded. "That's fair, I reckon. But I can promise you this. I'm not going anywhere until I know you're both safe. Until your mama's strong again. Until you've got what you need to face whatever comes next." Silas met her eyes steadily. "And I can promise that I'll keep coming back. Even if I leave sometimes, I'll always come back. That's not something I've said to anyone in 4 years." "You promise." "I promise." Grace studied his face for a long moment, reading something there that seemed to satisfy her. Then she nodded and returned her attention to her biscuit. Clara watched the exchange with an expression Silas couldn't quite interpret. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I think you're already home, Silas Brennan. You just haven't realized it yet." He didn't respond. Couldn't. Because somewhere deep in his chest, in the place he'd kept locked and guarded for 4 years, something was shifting. Something that felt terrifyingly like belonging. Outside, the Montana wind howled against the cabin walls, but inside the fire burned steady and bright. 3 people who'd been strangers 48 hours ago sat together in a space that was slowly becoming something none of them had expected. A family. Broken and rebuilt. Found in the most unlikely circumstances. And Silas Brennan, who'd spent 4 years running from exactly this, found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, he'd been running toward it all along. 2 weeks passed, and Clara grew stronger each day. She could sit up without help, now could walk short distances across the cabin, could even manage light tasks like mending clothes or peeling vegetables. Dr. Holloway had visited twice more, pronouncing her recovery remarkable, and warning against overexertion in the same breath. Silas had fallen into rhythms he hadn't known he was capable of anymore. Up before dawn to feed Copper and check the lean-to. Breakfast with Grace while Clara rested. Then, hours of work chopping wood, repairing gaps in the cabin walls, reinforcing the roof where winter had found weaknesses. The physical labor felt good, honest. It gave his hands something to do, while his mind wrestled with questions he still couldn't answer. "You're brooding again," Clara said one morning, watching him from the window where she'd stationed herself in a chair. "I can tell by the way you're attacking that woodpile." Silas paused mid-swing, the axe embedded in a stubborn log. "I don't brood." "You do. You get this look on your face like you're arguing with someone who isn't there." Clara's lips curved in a slight smile. "My husband used to do the same thing. I'd catch him staring at nothing, jaw tight, working through some problem he wouldn't talk about." "What did you do about it?" "Made him talk. Eventually." She pulled her shawl tighter. "You want to tell me what's eating at you, or should I guess?" Silas freed the axe and split the log with more force than necessary. "Nothing's eating at me." "Liar." The word was delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that Silas couldn't help but laugh. "You always this direct." "Life's too short for dancing around things. I learned that when Samuel died." Clara shifted in her chair, grimacing slightly at the movement. "Something changed in the last few days. You've been quieter, more distant. Grace noticed it too. She asked me if she'd done something wrong." That hit harder than Silas expected. The thought of Grace worrying that she'd caused his withdrawal made his chest tighten. "She didn't do anything wrong." "Then what is it?" Silas drove the axe into the chopping block and turned to face Clara fully. She looked better than she had even a week ago, color in her cheeks, clarity in her eyes, strength slowly returning to her frame. But she also looked worried, and he hated that he'd put that expression there. "I got a letter," he said finally. "Picked it up when I went into town for supplies yesterday." "A letter from whom?" "Sheriff back in Kansas. Man named Garrett, who took over after I left." Silas pulled the folded paper from his pocket, but didn't open it. "He's been trying to track me down for 3 years. Finally caught up with my trail." Clara's expression shifted, wariness creeping in. "What does he want?" "Wants me to come back. Says there's been a string of robberies along the railroad, same pattern as a gang I was tracking before I left. Says they need someone who knows the case, knows the territory, knows how these men think." Silas stared at the letter like it might bite him. "Says they need me." Silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to name. "Are you going to go?" Clara's voice was carefully neutral. "I don't know." "When do they need an answer?" "Letters dated 3 weeks ago. By now they've either solved it without me or they're desperate enough to wait." Clara was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "What do you want to do?" The question cut straight to the heart of everything Silas had been wrestling with since the letter arrived. What did he want? For 4 years, wanting things had felt dangerous, impossible. He'd trained himself to need nothing, expect nothing, want nothing beyond the next meal and the next mile. But now, standing in the yard of this cabin with Clara watching him and Grace somewhere inside practicing her letters, he found that the old numbness wouldn't hold. He wanted things, specific things, things that scared him because they could be taken away. "I want to stay," he admitted. "I want to finish fixing this place up for winter. I want to teach Grace to ride like I promised. I want to see you get strong enough to be the stubborn woman your husband fell in love with." He paused, the next words harder to say. "I want to stop running. I just don't know if I know how." Clara pushed herself up from the chair and walked toward him slowly, still careful with her recovering strength. When she reached him, she took the letter from his hands. "May I?" He nodded. She read it in silence, her expression giving nothing away. When she finished, she folded it neatly and handed it back. "They're not asking you to come back permanently. They're asking for help with one case. I know. And you feel obligated because you started the investigation before you left." "Partly." "What's the other part?" Silas looked away toward the mountains that rose purple and white against the winter sky. "Part of me thinks I don't deserve this. Don't deserve a family, a home, people who count on me. Part of me thinks I should go back to being useful in the only way I know how, hunting criminals, enforcing law, doing the job I was trained for. And the part that wants to stay. That part's terrified. Because the last time I let myself belong somewhere, I lost everything. And I don't know if I can survive that again." Clara's hand found his, her fingers interlacing with his in a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks. He'd stopped pulling away from her touch somewhere around day 5, started looking forward to it around day 10. "Silas, look at me." He did. Her eyes were fierce with something he couldn't name. "You're not the same man who lost his wife and son. You've spent 4 years becoming someone different, someone who stops for crying children, who gives everything he has to save, strangers, who keeps promises even when it's hard." Clara's grip tightened. That man doesn't have to go back to Kansas to prove he's worthy. He's already proven it. "Clara." "I'm not finished." Her voice brooked no argument. "If you go back to Kansas because you want to, because finishing that case matters to you, then go. Grace and I will be here when you return. But if you're going because you think you don't deserve to stay, because some part of you is still punishing yourself for what happened 4 years ago, then don't. Don't use duty as an excuse to run from something that scares you." The words landed like blows, each one finding a tender spot he'd tried to protect. "How do you know me so well?" he asked quietly. "We've known each other barely 3 weeks. Because I recognize the look in your eyes. It's the same look I saw in my own reflection for months after Samuel died. The look of someone who thinks they failed so badly that happiness is no longer an option." Clara's thumb traced circles on the back of his hand. "I was wrong about that. And so are you." Before Silas could respond, the cabin door banged open and Grace came running out, her face flushed with excitement. "Silas! Mama! There's someone coming. A whole wagon coming down the trail." They turned to look, and sure enough, a wagon was making its way through the snow toward the cabin. As it drew closer, Silas recognized the driver, a man he'd seen in town, heavy-set and prosperous-looking, with the bearing of someone who expected to be obeyed. "That's Hiram Thornton," Clara said quietly, her hand still in his, but suddenly tense. "Edith's husband." "The one who turned Grace away?" "The same." Silas positioned himself slightly in front of Clara. A protective instinct he didn't bother to question. Grace retreated to her mother's side, watching the approaching wagon with wary eyes. Thornton pulled his horses to a stop and climbed down with the grunt of a man whose joints protested the cold. He was older than Silas had expected, mid-60s at least, with a face weathered by decades of Montana winters. "Mrs. Weston," he said, tipping his hat with stiff formality. "I've come to discuss business." "Business?" Clara's voice was carefully neutral. "Your husband owed me money when he died. $200 for equipment and livestock I fronted him last spring. I've been patient given your circumstances, but patience has limits." Silas felt Clara stiffen beside him. "Samuel paid you $50 before he died. You agreed that cleared the debt." "I agreed to no such thing. Your husband may have believed the debt was cleared, but I have records showing otherwise." Thornton's expression didn't change. $200, Mrs. Weston. I'll need payment by spring, or I'll be forced to take other measures." "What other measures?" "This land isn't worth much, but it's worth something. The cabin, the improvements your husband made, the livestock you no longer have. It all adds up. If you can't pay what's owed, I'll be within my rights to claim the property." Grace's hand found Silas's coat and gripped tight. He could feel her trembling, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "You can't do that," the girl said, her voice shaking but defiant. "This is our home. Papa built it." "Grace." Clara's warning tone was gentle but firm. "Let me handle this." "But Mama." "I said let me handle it." Grace fell silent, but her grip on Silas's coat didn't loosen. Clara straightened her shoulders, drawing herself up despite her still recovering strength. "Mr. Thornton, my husband kept careful records. Every transaction, every payment, every agreement. If you have documentation showing a debt of $200, I'd like to see it compared against Samuel's books. Your husband's records are hardly—" "My husband was a meticulous man. If there's a discrepancy between his records and yours, I suspect his will prove more accurate." Clara's voice was steel-wrapped in silk. "I'll review the documents and provide a response by week's end. In the meantime, I'll thank you to keep your threats about claiming property to yourself." Thornton's face reddened. Clearly, he wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by a widow he'd expected to intimidate. "Now see here. Mr. Thornton." Silas spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying. "The lady asked you to provide documentation. I suggest you do that and leave." Thornton's eyes narrowed. "And who might you be?" "Silas Brennan. I've been helping Mrs. Weston through her recovery." "Helping." The word dripped with implication. "I've heard talk in town about the stranger living out here. Folks wondering what kind of arrangement you've got going with the widow." Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. Folks should mind their own business. Hard to do when impropriety is happening right under our noses. A man and woman living together without benefit of marriage in front of a child, no less. "That's enough." Clara stepped forward, putting herself between Silas and Thornton. "What happens in my home is none of your concern, Hiram. And if you're planning to spread gossip to cover the fact that you're trying to steal land from a widow and orphan, you might want to reconsider. Because unlike you, I have nothing to be ashamed of." Thornton's face had gone from red to purple. "You'll regret this, Clara. Mark my words, you'll regret this." "The only thing I regret is thinking you were ever a friend to this family." Clara's voice didn't waver. "Now get off my land. Off my—" For a moment, Silas thought Thornton might argue further, but something in Clara's expression, or perhaps in Silas's stance behind her, made the older man reconsider. He climbed back into his wagon with more haste than dignity. "You have until spring," he called as he turned the horses. $200 or I take what's owed. That's the law." They watched him go in silence. Only when the wagon had disappeared over the ridge did Grace's grip on Silas's coat finally loosen. "Mama, are we going to lose our home?" Clara knelt down, taking her daughter's hands. "No, baby, we're not. Your papa didn't owe that man anywhere near what he's claiming, and I can prove it." "But if you can't, if the books don't show—" "Then we'll figure something out. We always do." Clara pulled Grace into a hug. "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Grace nodded against her mother's shoulder, but her eyes found Silas over Clara's back. The question in them was clear. "Are you going to help us?" He answered without speaking, just a small nod that carried more weight than any words could have. After Grace had been sent inside with promises that everything would be all right, Clara turned to Silas with exhaustion written across her face. "He's lying. Samuel paid that debt. I remember the conversation. Thornton agreed $50 would clear what was owed." "But you don't have proof." "I have Samuel's books. If he recorded the payment, it'll be there." Clara pressed her hands to her temples. "But Thornton's a powerful man in these parts. Even if I can prove he's lying, getting anyone to stand against him." He mentioned gossip. About us. Clara's expression flickered embarrassment, maybe, or anger. "Let them talk. I've got bigger problems than what small-minded people think about my living arrangements. It could hurt you, hurt Grace. Reputation matters out here." "And what would you have me do? Send you away to satisfy propriety after everything you've done for us?" Clara shook her head. "I'd rather be talked about than dead, Silas. And without you here these past weeks, that's exactly what I'd be." Clara. "No, I'm not discussing this." Her jaw set in the stubborn line he'd come to recognize. "You're staying as long as you want to stay. Whatever Thornton or anyone else thinks about that is their problem, not mine." She turned and walked back toward the cabin, her steps steadier than they'd been even a week ago. Silas watched her go, his mind churning with everything that had happened in the past hour. The letter from Kansas, Thornton's threats, the gossip spreading through town. Each problem demanding attention, demanding decisions, demanding he choose what kind of man he was going to be. That evening, after Grace had gone to bed, Silas and Clara sat by the fire with Samuel's account book spread between them. The records were meticulous, just as Clara had claimed, every transaction noted, every payment documented, every agreement spelled out in careful handwriting. "Here." Clara pointed to an entry dated the previous April. $50 paid to H. Thornton, settling equipment loan in full. Samuel even noted that Thornton shook his hand and called it square. So Thornton's lying. Of course he's lying. He's been trying to get his hands on this land since before Samuel died. Wanted to expand his ranch, saw our hollow as the perfect addition. Clara's voice was bitter. Samuel always said Thornton would make a move eventually. Just didn't expect it to be against a widow and orphan. "What do you want to do?" "Fight him. Take Samuel's books to the judge in Cedar Falls and prove Thornton's claim is false." Clara met his eyes. "But I can't do it alone. I'm still too weak to make the trip, and even if I wasn't a woman's word against a man like Thornton." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Silas understood how the world worked, how power and gender shaped whose truth got believed. "I'll go with you," he said. "When you're strong enough. We'll go together and make the case." "And the letter, Kansas?" Silas looked at the fire for a long moment. The flames danced and crackled, throwing shadows across the cabin walls. "Kansas has waited 3 years. It can wait a little longer." He turned back to Clara. "I made a promise to stay until you were safe. You're not safe yet, so I'm not leaving." The relief in Clara's eyes was so profound it made his chest ache. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. Even with people talking, even with Thornton threatening, even with all of it." Silas reached across the space between them and took her hand. "I spent 4 years running from responsibility, from connection, from anything that might make me care about something enough to lose it. I'm tired, Clara. Tired of running. Tired of being alone. Tired of pretending that keeping my distance from people makes me strong instead of just scared." Clara's fingers interlaced with his, holding tight. "What does that mean? For us?" "It means I'm staying. Not just until you're strong, or until Thornton's dealt with, or until some arbitrary deadline I've set in my head. It means I'm staying because this is where I want to be. With you. With Grace. Building something instead of running from everything." Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks, but she was smiling. "Samuel would say you're crazy. Walking into a fight that's not yours, taking on a man like Thornton, committing to a broken-down homestead with a widow and a child. What would you say? I'd say, Clara's voice caught. I'd say you're the bravest man I've ever met. And I'd say I'm grateful every day that my daughter found you on that trail. Silas leaned forward close enough to see the firelight reflected in her eyes. Clara, I need to tell you something. What? I'm falling in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, terrifying and liberating all at once. He'd said them, out loud. After 4 years of feeling nothing, he'd admitted to feeling everything. Clara's breath caught. Silas, you don't have to say anything back. I know it's too soon, too complicated, too much after everything you've been through. But I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I couldn't pretend that what I feel for you is just gratitude, or obligation, or... She kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, like a question being asked. Then her hand came up to cup his face, and the kiss deepened, became an answer, became a promise neither of them had planned to make. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Clara's eyes were bright with tears and laughter. I've been waiting for you to figure that out, she whispered. I was starting to think you never would. You knew. I hoped. She traced her thumb across his cheekbone. After Samuel died, I thought that part of my life was over. The love part. The partner part. I thought I'd spend the rest of my years just surviving for Grace's sake. Her voice broke slightly. Then you walked through that door and everything changed. Clara, I'm broken in ways you don't know. Damaged by what happened in Kansas. I might never be whole. She smiled through her tears. Neither am I. Neither is anyone who's really lived. But broken pieces can fit together, Silas. They can make something new. Something that wouldn't exist if everything had stayed perfect. He pulled her close, holding her against his chest, feeling her heart beat against his. Outside, the Montana wind howled, but inside this cabin, warmth and light and something like hope filled every corner. What happens now? He asked against her hair. Now we fight Thornton. We build this homestead into something Grace can be proud of. We face whatever comes together instead of alone. Clara pulled back enough to meet his eyes. And somewhere along the way, we figure out what kind of family we're going to be. A real one. The only kind worth having. Silas kissed her again, sealing a promise that had been building since the moment he'd stopped his horse on a snow-covered trail and decided to answer a child's desperate cry. He'd spent 4 years running from love, from loss, from the possibility of pain. But here in this cabin with this woman in his arms and her daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, he finally understood what he'd really been running from. Hope. The terrifying, wonderful possibility that happiness wasn't finished with him after all. And now, having found it against all odds, he wasn't going to let it go without a fight. The morning they rode into Cedar Falls for the hearing, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. Silas helped Clara into the wagon he'd borrowed from Mrs. Thornton. Edith had insisted, despite her husband's fury, while Grace sat between them, clutching Samuel's account books like they were made of gold. You nervous? Silas asked Clara as they started down the trail. Terrified. She didn't try to hide it. Thornton's got money influence friends on the town council. We've got ledger entries and the word of a widow. You've got more than that. You've got the truth. The truth doesn't always win, Silas. You know that better than most. He did know it. He'd seen guilty men walk free and innocent ones hang. But he'd also seen justice prevail when it shouldn't have, when the odds were stacked against it, when all that stood between right and wrong was someone willing to stand up and fight. Maybe not, he said, but it's going to win today. Grace looked up at him with those two old eyes. You promise? I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure it does. That's the only promise I can honestly make. She considered this, then nodded. That's enough. Mama says honest promises are the only kind worth making. Your mama's a wise woman. Clara's hand found his on the wagon seat, squeezing once before letting go. They didn't need words anymore, not for some things. The courthouse was a modest building on the main street, 2 stories of whitewashed wood, with a bell tower that had never held a bell. Judge Harrison, a lean man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness, presided over the hearing room. Thornton was already there when they arrived, flanked by 2 men Silas recognized as his ranch hands. He looked smug, confident, the expression of a man who'd already decided how things were going to go. "Mrs. Weston," he said with exaggerated courtesy. "So glad you could make it, and I see you've brought your friend." "Mr. Brennan is here as a witness," Clara replied coolly. "As is my daughter. A child and a drifter, impressive defense. Better than a liar and his hired muscle." Thornton's face reddened, but before he could respond, Judge Harrison called the room to order. The hearing proceeded much as Silas had expected. Thornton presented his claim, $200, allegedly owed by Samuel Weston, documented in what he called official records, that looked suspiciously new for documents supposedly created over a year ago. Then it was Clara's turn. She stood slowly still, careful with her recovering strength, and approached the judge's bench with Samuel's account books. Her voice was steady as she explained each entry, each payment, each conversation she'd witnessed between her husband and Thornton. "And this entry here," she said, pointing to the April notation, "records the final payment of $50 which Mr. Thornton himself acknowledged as settling the debt in full." My husband shook his hand. They called it square. "She's lying," Thornton interrupted. "Her husband was confused about our arrangement. $50 was a partial payment, not a settlement." "Then why didn't you send any further invoices? Why didn't you demand payment during the 8 months between that handshake and my husband's death?" "I was being patient, giving your family time to get on your feet." "Patient?" Clara's voice sharpened. "You've been trying to claim our land since before Samuel died. You offered to buy it 3 times, and each time he refused. This isn't about debt, Hiram. This is about you wanting something that doesn't belong to you and using a widow's vulnerability to take it." The room went quiet. Thornton's face had gone from red to purple, and Silas tensed, ready to intervene if the man made any threatening moves. "Your Honor," Thornton said through clenched teeth, "this woman is making baseless accusations to distract from her own failure to pay legitimate debts." Judge Harrison held up a hand for silence. He studied the documents before him, both Thornton's claim and Samuel's account books, with the careful attention of a man who'd seen too many disputes to take anything at face value. "Mr. Thornton," he said finally, "your documentation shows a debt of $200 dated April of last year. Yet there's no payment schedule, no interest calculation, no record of any communication requesting payment. Mrs. Weston's books, on the other hand, show a detailed transaction history, including a final payment that her husband noted as settling all accounts with you." The judge's eyes were cold. "Either Mr. Weston was a remarkably imaginative bookkeeper, or your claim isn't worth the paper it's written on." "Your Honor, I object to." "I'm not finished." Harrison's voice cut through Thornton's protest. "I've known you for 20 years, Hiram. Watched you build your ranch into one of the biggest operations in the territory. But I've also watched how you do business. Pressure tactics, convenient documentation, debts that grow mysteriously after the debtor dies." Thornton went pale. "That's slander." "It's observation." The judge turned to Clara. "Mrs. Weston, do you have anyone who can corroborate your account of the handshake agreement?" "I do." The voice came from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Edith Thornton standing in the doorway, her face set with determination despite the trembling of her hands. "I was there when Samuel paid. I heard my husband say $50 would make them even, and I'll swear to that under oath." The silence that followed was absolute. Hiram Thornton stared at his wife like he'd never seen her before. "Edith, what are you doing? What I should have done months ago." She walked forward, her steps steady, even though her voice shook. "I'm telling the truth, Hiram. Something you seem to have forgotten how to do. You'd testify against your own husband. I'd testify for what's right." Edith stopped beside Clara, and something passed between the two women, understanding perhaps, or solidarity. "I've spent 30 years watching you take advantage of people who couldn't fight back. I won't be part of it anymore." Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "Well, that's quite a development." He shuffled his papers, clearly buying time to process what had just happened. "Mrs. Thornton, are you prepared to make a formal statement?" "I am." "Then I'd like to hear it." Edith's testimony was brief, but devastating. She confirmed the handshake agreement, confirmed that her husband had never expected further payment, confirmed that his sudden claim against Clara was motivated by nothing more than greed and opportunity. When she finished, Judge Harrison rendered his verdict without hesitation. "The claim against the Weston estate is dismissed. Mr. Thornton, I strongly suggest you reconsider your business practices before I'm forced to consider them more formally." He banged his gavel. "Court is adjourned." The room erupted in murmurs, but Silas barely heard them. He was watching Clara, watching the way her shoulders dropped as months of tension finally released, watching Grace throw her arms around her mother with a joy that seemed too big for her small body to contain. They'd won. Against all odds, against power and money, and a system that usually favored men like Thornton, they'd won. Silas stood back, letting them have their moment, but Clara's eyes found his across the room. She mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." He shook his head slightly. She'd done this. She and her daughter, and the unlikely ally who'd found the courage to stand against her own husband. He'd just been there to support them. But as Clara crossed the room toward him, her face glowing with relief and triumph, Silas felt something shift in his chest. The last barrier. The final wall. The piece of himself he'd been holding back even as he'd admitted to loving her. He let it go. "We won," Clara said, stopping in front of him. "You won. I just watched." "You did more than watch. You stayed. You fought alongside us. You made me believe we could actually beat him." Her hand came up to rest on his chest, right over his heart. "I couldn't have done this without you." "Yes, you could have. You're the strongest woman I've ever met." "Maybe. But being strong alone and being strong with someone beside you, they're not the same thing." Clara's eyes glistened. "I'm tired of being strong alone, Silas. I want to be strong with you." Before he could respond, a small body crashed into both of them. Grace, her face wet with tears and split by a grin. "We get to keep our home. We get to stay. We do, baby." Clara wrapped one arm around her daughter while keeping her other hand on Silas's chest. "We get to stay. And Silas, too. He gets to stay, too." Clara looked at him, the question in her eyes reflecting her daughter's. "Yeah," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion. "I get to stay, too." Grace whooped with joy and hugged them both tighter. Over her head, Silas met Clara's gaze, and something passed between them. A promise, a commitment, a future neither had dared to imagine, until now. The ride back to the cabin felt different than the ride in. The weight that had pressed down on all of them for weeks was gone, replaced by a lightness that bordered on giddiness. Grace chattered constantly, already making plans for spring planting and summer adventures, and all the things they'd do now that they weren't facing the loss of everything they had. Clara sat close to Silas on the wagon seat, her shoulder pressed against his, her hand occasionally finding his knee. They didn't speak much, didn't need to. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with understanding rather than uncertainty. As the cabin came into view, Silas pulled the wagon to a stop. "What's wrong?" Clara asked. "Nothing's wrong." He climbed down and walked around to help her from the wagon, then lifted Grace down after. But instead of heading toward the cabin, he turned to face them both. "There's something I need to say. Both of you." Grace looked worried. "Is it bad?" "No, sweetheart. It's not bad. He crouched down to meet her eyes. You asked me once if I was going to stay forever. I said I didn't know because forever was a long time to promise. I remember. Well, I've been thinking about it, a lot. And I've realized something. He took Grace's hands in his. Forever isn't really about time. It's about choosing. It's about waking up every day and deciding to be there for the people who matter. He swallowed hard. Grace, I want to be there for you, or every day, for as long as you'll have me. I want to teach you to ride and help you with your letters and watch you grow up into the amazing woman I know you're going to be. Tears were streaming down Grace's face, but she was smiling. Does that mean you're going to be my pa? Silas's throat closed up. He looked at Clara, who was crying openly, her hand pressed to her mouth. That's not my decision alone, he said carefully. Your mama and I would need to talk about... I've already talked about it, Clara interrupted. With myself, with Samuel's memory, with God. I've talked about it every night since you told me you loved me. She knelt down beside them, her hand finding Silas's shoulder. Grace, what would you think about Silas becoming part of our family? Officially. Grace threw herself at Silas with enough force to knock him backward into the snow. Her arms wrapped around his neck and she was laughing and crying all at once. Yes, 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 yes. I want that more than anything. Silas held her tight, feeling her small body shake with joy, and something that had been frozen inside him for 4 years finally completely thawed. He'd thought he would never have this, the love of a child, the trust of a family, the feeling of belonging somewhere. But here it was. Here they were. His family. Clara knelt beside them in the snow, her arms going around them both. So that's a yes, she asked, laughing through her tears. You'll marry me. Make this official. Clara Weston, I would marry you right here in this snowbank if you'd have me. I'd prefer the church if it's all the same to you. I think Grace would like to wear her Sunday dress. I would. Grace pulled back her face, lit with excitement. Can we have a cake, and can Mrs. Thornton come? She stood up for us. She should be there. Edith can come, Clara agreed. And we'll have a cake, and anything else you want, baby. This is going to be a celebration. They eventually made it inside the cabin, all 3 of them wet from the snow, and not caring in the slightest. Silas built up the fire while Grace danced around the room, planning wedding details, and Clara sat in her chair by the window, watching them both with an expression of pure contentment. Later, after Grace had finally worn herself out and fallen asleep in her bed, Silas and Clara sat together by the fire. You're sure about this? Silas asked. Marriage is forever, and I'm still figuring out who I am after Kansas, still healing from... Clara silenced him with a kiss. I'm sure. I've never been more sure of anything. She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. We're both damaged, Silas, both carrying scars from things we've lost, but that doesn't disqualify us from happiness. It just means we understand the cost of it. Samuel would have liked you. He would have trusted you with me, with Grace, with everything he built. Clara's voice was soft but certain. I've made my peace with loving again. Have you? Silas thought about Eleanor. About the son he'd never held. About the guilt and grief that had driven him across 6 territories, trying to outrun his own heart. Then he thought about Grace grabbing his boot in the snow. About Clara fighting for her life while her daughter kept vigil. About the way this family had taken him in and made him whole again. Yeah, he said finally. I have. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Cedar Falls. Grace stood beside her mother holding flowers she'd picked from the early spring blooms that had started pushing through the snow. Dr. Holloway attended, having declared himself a friend of the family after everything that had happened, and Edith Thornton came alone, her husband having left town rather than face the scandal of her testimony. Do you, Silas Brennan, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Silas looked at Clara, at her glowing face, at the joy in her eyes, at the future she represented. "I do." "And do you, Clara Weston, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you man and wife." When Silas kissed her, Grace cheered loud enough to startle birds from the rafters. The small gathering of witnesses' neighbors who'd once turned away, but had since found their consciences applauded with genuine warmth. Walking out of the church with Clara on one arm and Grace holding his hand on the other side, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years. Peace. Not the absence of pain that would never fully go away, but peace alongside it. The knowledge that he'd stopped running, stopped hiding, stopped punishing himself for failures he couldn't undo. He'd found a home, a family, a future worth fighting for. That spring they planted crops in the expanded garden and added chickens to the homestead. Silas finally taught Grace to ride, and she took to it like she'd been born in the saddle. Clara grew stronger every day, her stubbornness finding expression in plans for improvements and expansions that would make their hollow into something Samuel would have been proud of. And in early summer, Clara told him she was pregnant. Silas's reaction was complicated joy and terror mixed in equal measure, the memory of Eleanor's death never far from his thoughts. But Clara took his face in her hands and made him look at her. "This isn't Kansas," she said. "I'm not Eleanor, and you're not the same man who lost everything 4 years ago." She kissed him gently. "We're going to have this baby together, Silas, and whatever happens, we're going to face it together." He believed her. For the first time since losing everything, he believed that good things could happen to him, that he deserved them. Their son was born in December, exactly 1 year after Silas had stopped his horse on a snowy trail and decided to help a desperate child. They named him Samuel after the man whose love had built the cabin where they now lived, and whose legacy lived on in the daughter he'd raised so well. Grace was enchanted with her baby brother taking to her role as big sister with the same fierce dedication she brought to everything else. She held him carefully, sang to him in a voice that had finally learned to sound like a child's again, and declared him the best present she'd ever received. "Better than riding lessons?" Silas asked. "Better than everything." Grace looked up at him with eyes that held no shadows anymore. "Because now we're really a family, a complete one." Silas looked at his wife nursing their son and his daughter beaming with pride at the cabin Samuel Weston had built, and Silas Brennan had helped save. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Complete." Years later, when people asked him about his life, Silas would tell them about the day a crying child asked for help, and he'd been smart enough to stop. He'd tell them about a woman too stubborn to die and too proud to accept charity, but brave enough to accept love. He'd tell them about building something from almost nothing, about second chances, and the courage it took to risk caring again. But mostly, he'd tell them about the moment everything changed. The moment he'd heard a child's desperate cry and made a choice that seemed small, but wasn't. The choice to stop running, to stay, to become the man he was meant to be, instead of the ghost he'd been pretending to be. Sometimes on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep, and Clara sat beside him watching the Montana sky fade from day to night, he'd think about all the ways his life could have been different, all the trails he could have taken, all the people he could have passed, all the cries for help he could have ignored. But he'd stopped, he'd listened, he'd stayed. And in doing so, he'd found everything he thought he'd lost forever. A family, a home, a heart that could love again. The road that led to the Weston cabin had been covered in snow the day Silas first traveled it, following a desperate girl with frozen feet and a faith that refused to die. That road had changed him, saved him, given him a life worth living. And every day, he was grateful he'd had the courage to follow it home. Because home wasn't a place. It was the people who made you want to stay. The people who saw your broken pieces and loved you anyway. The people who gave you a reason to stop running and start building. Silas Brennan had spent 4 years searching for something he couldn't name. He'd found it in a snowstorm, in a child's desperate eyes, in a woman's stubborn heart. He'd found it here, and he was never letting it go.